Jean-Jacques Rousseau, lionized philosopher, author of The Social Contract, and self-proclaimed best of all possible men, was a deluded, paranoid hypocrite. This bright light of idealism disguised the madness of disowning his 5 children, all of whom died in orphanages. Today, in Europe, the young are sacrificed for the sake of a new social contract, austerity and its brother, inequality. The philosophy of austerity has opened the door to a new legal framework where the fiscal sins of the fathers are vested on the sons and daughters. The economic platforms of hyper-consumerism, wage compression and subprime lending have cracked, and this generation has fallen through the floor. If austerity was necessary, was it prudent? Was it too fast? Was it fair?
In the last few years, austerity measures imposed from financial institutions from the Troika have meant that inequality has grown. I mean, if you look at countries like Greece, what we see is that in the last 5-6 years, the lowest 10% of the population has actually become the 20th percent, and the very 1 or 2% have actually increased their wealth. I mean, there is now a policy for actually giving to the rich more money and throwing more and more people into dire poverty in Europe.
French economist Thomas Piketty wrote that the main force pushing towards reduction in inequality has always been the diffusion of knowledge and the diffusion of education. But is austerity achieving an ever closer Europe? And can education pull Europe's lost generation out of the inequality gap?
In the case of the US, probably more unequal access to skills in the US, with due partly to rising tuition fees in US universities and insufficient public investment, can explain why rising inequality has been particularly large in the US. You also need to invest in education and skills so that workers can take high productivity jobs. So all these different policies are complementary. You need both labor market institution, educational institution.
The trend of inequality comes before the financial crisis and before the austerity measures. But obviously what has happened is that people that lost the job because of the crisis, they were hit double time when they would have to pay for health services that they were provided before or for the education services that they were provided before. So the social protection system has failed these people that were hit already by the crisis.
In their Bruegel research paper, Poor and Under Pressure, the social impact of Europe's fiscal consolidation, Zsolt Darvas and Olga Shakasin explain that fiscal consolidation, commonly called austerity, has exaggerated social hardship.
I think austerity was needed in a number of countries. For example, if you look at Greece or Spain or Ireland, where either public debt or the budget deficit was super high. A bigger concern, I think, is the composition.
Intentionally or not, say Darvas and Shakasin, there was a redistribution from families and children towards pensioners. Unemployment benefit expenditure may have mitigated the adverse impact of unemployment in countries where unemployment increased the most, but it came at the expense of spending on education. Education spending was significantly reduced in the most vulnerable countries, and this can also adversely affect the young generation.
In most part of Europe, like in Germany, but also in France, I would say Netherlands and so on, there was no need to rush to fiscal austerity at a time, when public debt was not that high. But since there was a preference after the Greek crisis to put public houses in order, there was a major emphasis on fiscal austerity throughout Europe.
A certain fiscal discipline is needed, no problem with that one. But the Growth and Stability Pact is a clear mistake. As other ones said it, Molière in the time, when you have someone who is ill, you don't bleed him because you will make him weaker and weaker. The idea of blind austerity and this belief in social dumping and competitiveness only through the labor cost, that brought a real damage to the EU.
Coming from Portugal, where we were subjected to this Troika program and all these neoliberal austerity measures, for what? I mean, our debt is much worse than it was at the beginning. The control of the deficit is minimal. The growth is absolutely anemic. And the level of unemployment is tremendous. We have destroyed wealth in my country. What for? The fundamentals are not better. The basic reforms of the state have not been made. And we have actually watched injustice grow, and that is the perception of the citizens. And that's why the citizens are very upset with governments, but as well very upset with the European institutions, because they don't see them doing their job and defending the common European interest.
My name is Robert Reich. I was Secretary of Labor under Bill Clinton. Before that, the Carter administration. Before that, I was a special aide to Abraham Lincoln.
In a new film documentary called Inequality for All, Bill Clinton's Labour Secretary Robert Reich explains why the inequality gap in the United States and Europe is not a sustainable business model. Basically, for the rich to get richer, they need a strong, broad middle class. The middle class must have a steady disposable income so they can buy goods and services. If wages stagnate or decline in real terms, the rich guys can't sell their products.
It's about sustainability of the business model. It's about not just about the consumers that are there for your products and the demand that exists for your product. And I guess the situation where Europe finds itself now is exactly an illustration of that kind of contradiction.
People who have to fight for every single meal, who have to fight to get their children through the day, will not have the capacity, will not have the creative space either to become a very active part of society, to become entrepreneurs, for example. So this is also really something that holds societies back as a whole. And of course, if there's only a few rich people who are trying to sell goods and there's nobody who can buy them, then that's not helpful for them either.
The reality is that we know, and is the IMF, is the OECD saying that inequality and growing inequality is bad for the economy, is bad for the growth, because there's less availability of spending, and it really makes the kickoff of the crisis worse. It's also bad for social cohesion, because there is instability and there is social protest and disaffection towards the democracy.
Of course, if you have big inequality, then you're also nurturing the ground for more discontent and also for more crime. If people don't see any other opportunities, if people are socially excluded, then it's not a big surprise if those things go together.
There are very serious political reactions. You've been seeing that, and you're seeing that when you see, for instance, the rise of anti-democratic, xenophobic, populist forces in several European countries, not to mention Nazi and fascist forces. This is a consequence of the fact that the middle classes have been under attack.
Do you think there is an anti-democratic element to austerity?
I think that the way the negotiations, that's what we said, Troika. Now the name Troika disappeared. But nevertheless, if you see what's happening today and what will happen, again, what is the sense of the IMF trying to further dismantle the social cohesion in Greece? Yes, there is a real question. And why is the Commission so absent? The dismantling of a social dialogue in Greece. It's not the Iron Law that is trying to rebuild it. It should have been the EU.
The astonishingly good economic record of US President Bill Clinton gives him some authority to say it turns out that advancing equal opportunity and economic empowerment is both morally right and good economics, because discrimination, poverty and ignorance restrict growth while investments in education, infrastructure and scientific and technological research increase it, creating more good jobs and new wealth for all of us.
The key is to raise education levels for all, so that everybody has the opportunity to gain the skills they need to compete and work and sell themselves in the global economy. And if we can do that, I think there's no reason why we should see rising inequality.
There's no magic solution, but I think there are a few elements that I think could solve that issue, and that is education and integration. Education is key. When we're talking about people with disabilities, people who migrate to different countries, it may mean for them learning a language and skills and integrate into that society.
It's time for a new social contract. It cannot be the work of technocrats without the spirit of the age. nor the reckless rhetoric of parochial politicians. For Europe to succeed as a democratic, prosperous, peaceful union, the paranoid, deluded, hypocritical philosophy of blind austerity must be consigned to history, or history will repeat itself, and our next generation will inherit the fate of Rousseau's children.